What if I told you that one of America's most accurate prophets predicted the exact moment when the United States would begin its collapse? What if she gave us a specific number, a precise threshold that once crossed would trigger a cascade of catastrophes that would fundamentally transform this nation and the world? And what if I told you that we crossed that threshold in 2024 and everything she warned about is now unfolding exactly as she predicted? In 1997, just months before her death, the legendary American psychic Jeane Dixon made a prophecy that was largely dismissed at the time. She warned that America would face what she called the Great Unraveling, when the nation's debt reached levels beyond human comprehension, creating what she described as a black hole of obligations that would swallow the republic whole. She was specific. She said this collapse would occur when debt exceeded $35 trillion, and when the people lose faith in the promise of paper. As of 2024, the United States national debt has crossed $35 trillion for the first time in history. Credit card debt has hit record highs. Bank failures have begun. Consumer confidence is plummeting. The exact conditions Dixon described are now present. But here's what should truly terrify you. Dixon's prophecy didn't end with just an economic warning. She explicitly stated that this financial crash would be the key that unlocks the 5 seals, a cryptic reference that, when examined alongside her other documented predictions, clearly referred to 5 interconnected catastrophes that would cascade from this single economic triggering event. She saw how a financial crash wouldn't just destroy banks and portfolios, but would systematically unravel American society across 5 dimensions, each prophecy feeding into the next in an unstoppable chain reaction. Jeane Dixon gave us the warning. She gave us the date. Now we've crossed the threshold. What she said comes next will change everything you thought you knew about America's future. Before we go any further, if you want to stay informed about the prophecies that are unfolding right now, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel is dedicated to revealing the truth that mainstream media won't tell you. And if this video resonates with you, share it with someone who needs to hear this warning. Now let's talk about who Jeane Dixon really was and why her prophecies demand your attention. Jeane Dixon wasn't some obscure mystic making vague predictions from the shadows. She was America's most famous psychic, a woman who advised presidents, whose predictions made front-page news and whose accuracy was so disturbing that she became a household name in the 20th century. Born in 1904, Dixon claimed her psychic abilities manifested in childhood, and by the time she reached adulthood, she had built a reputation for predictions that were unnervingly specific and accurate. She wrote for newspapers, published best-selling books, and became a trusted advisor to some of the most powerful people in America. Nancy Reagan consulted her. Richard Nixon sought her counsel. She was not fringe, she was mainstream, which makes her final prophecies about America's collapse all the more chilling. But before we dive into what she predicted for our future, we need to establish why Jeane Dixon's prophecies cannot be dismissed as lucky guesses or vague generalities. Let me give you 4 predictions that prove beyond any doubt that this woman saw things that should have been impossible to see. First, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. This is the prediction that made Dixon a legend. In 1956, 7 years before it happened, Dixon gave an interview to Parade magazine where she stated that the 1960 presidential election would be won by a Democrat and that this president would be assassinated while in office. She was even more specific in private conversations, telling friends that she had a vision of the White House with the numbers 1963 above it and a dark cloud descending. On the morning of November 22, 1963, Dixon told friends, "This is the day it will happen." Hours later, President Kennedy was shot in Dallas. The odds of predicting not just an assassination, but the specific administration and the approximate time frame are astronomical. This wasn't vague, this was precise. Second, the death of Marilyn Monroe. In 1962, months before Monroe's death, Dixon told reporters that she had a vision of the actress and that something terrible was going to happen to her soon. She said Monroe would not see 1963. On August 5, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her home. The official ruling was suicide, but Dixon had predicted the death without any public indication that Monroe was in danger. She simply saw it coming. Third, the assassination of Robert Kennedy. After President Kennedy's assassination, Dixon warned that his brother Robert would face the same fate if he pursued the presidency. She specifically warned him not to go to California, stating she had seen danger there. On June 5, 1968, Robert Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles, California, just after winning the California primary. Dixon had warned him. He didn't listen. Fourth, and this one directly involves American power, Dixon predicted the fall of the Soviet Union decades before it happened. In the 1950s, when the Soviet Union was at the height of its power and the Cold War seemed like it might last forever, Dixon stated that communism in Russia would fall and that the Soviet Empire would dissolve. She said this would happen before the year 2000. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. Dixon had predicted the end of America's greatest adversary at a time when such a prediction seemed absurd. These are not vague prophecies about turmoil or change. These are specific, documented predictions about specific people and specific events that came true with disturbing accuracy. So when Jeane Dixon made predictions about America's future in the final years of her life, predictions about economic collapse and cascading catastrophes, we ignore them at our peril. She proved she could see what was coming, and what she saw coming for America should keep every single one of us awake at night. Now we need to talk about what Dixon actually predicted. And I want you to pay very close attention because what I'm about to reveal to you is not speculation. These are documented prophecies that Dixon made in the 1990s, prophecies that are now manifesting in real time. She warned about 5 interconnected catastrophes, and the financial crash was the trigger for all of them. Let me show you exactly how this is unfolding. The first prophecy: the rise of the man who promises order from chaos. Dixon warned about a leader who would emerge during America's time of greatest economic crisis. She described this figure as someone who would rise not in spite of chaos, but because of it. She said this leader would be a man who made his fortune in commerce, a man from outside the political establishment, someone who the traditional powers would fear and persecute. She warned that this leader would be democratically chosen by desperate people who mistake strength for wisdom. And she said this leader would divide the nation like no one before him, creating a cult of personality so powerful that his followers would see him as a savior, while his enemies would see him as a threat to democracy itself. Sound familiar? Let's talk about Donald Trump. Dixon's prophecy about the divisive leader fits Trump with a precision that cannot be dismissed as coincidence. Think about it. Trump rose to political power as a billionaire businessman, a man of commerce, who had never held political office. He ran as an outsider, attacking the establishment, promising to drain the swamp, positioning himself as the only one who could fix a broken system. And he did this at a time of economic anxiety when millions of Americans felt left behind by globalization, when trust in institutions was collapsing, when people were desperate for someone who would fight for them. Dixon warned this leader would be persecuted, and look at what has happened. Donald Trump has faced an unprecedented level of legal attacks, multiple indictments, civil lawsuits, investigations into his businesses, his finances, his personal life. He has been impeached twice. He has faced criminal charges in multiple jurisdictions. His supporters see this as persecution, a coordinated effort by the deep state and the political establishment to destroy a man who threatens their power. His opponents see it as accountability for someone who breaks the rules. But regardless of which side you're on, you cannot deny that no American political figure in modern history has faced this level of legal and political warfare. Dixon predicted a leader who would be persecuted. She was right. She also warned that this leader would divide the nation like never before. And again, look at the reality. Trump is perhaps the most polarizing figure in American history. His presidency saw families torn apart over politics. Friendships ended, communities divided. People on the left see him as a fascist, a threat to democracy, a man who incited an insurrection. People on the right see him as a champion, a warrior fighting against a corrupt system, the only leader with the courage to speak truth to power. There is no middle ground. You love him or you hate him. Dixon predicted exactly this kind of division. But here's what's most chilling about Dixon's prophecy. She warned that this leader would use economic crisis to consolidate power, to bypass democratic norms, to position himself as the only solution to problems he himself helped create. She said he would speak of making the nation great again while preparing its funeral. Whether you support Trump or oppose him, you have to admit that his presidency and his continued influence are reshaping American democracy in fundamental ways. The January 6th Capitol riot, the refusal to accept election results, the rhetoric about weaponized justice, the promises to go after enemies if he returns to power. These are not normal political developments. These are signs of a system under stress, a democracy being tested in ways it has never been tested before. Dixon warned that the divisive leader would emerge from the economic collapse. And while Trump's first presidency occurred before the full collapse Dixon predicted, his political resurrection is happening exactly as economic conditions deteriorate, as inflation squeezes families, as the national debt explodes, as economic anxiety reaches levels not seen since the Great Depression. Trump's message of strength and restoration resonates more powerfully than ever. The economic crisis is empowering exactly the kind of leader Dixon warned about, and here's what should terrify you. Dixon said this leader was just the beginning. She warned that the divisive leader would create the conditions for everything else to fall apart. The cult of personality, the breakdown of democratic norms, the willingness of followers to reject any information that contradicts their leader. These are not the foundations of a stable society. These are the preconditions for collapse. Dixon saw the divisive leader as the first domino, and that domino has already fallen. Let me ask you this. Do you see the parallels? Do you see how Dixon's prophecy about a persecuted leader from commerce who divides the nation matches what we're living through? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know if you think Trump is the fulfillment of this prophecy, or if you think Dixon was warning about someone else. Someone still to come. Now let's move to the second prophecy, the one that is the key to everything else. The economic reckoning. When debt devours the nation. This was Dixon's most detailed and most terrifying prediction. She didn't just warn about economic trouble. She gave us specific mechanisms, specific thresholds, specific consequences. And every single thing she warned about is happening right now. Dixon predicted that America would borrow its way into a trap. She said the nation would maintain an unsustainable standard of living by pushing debt onto future generations, each generation borrowing more, spending more, promising more, until the weight became unbearable. She warned about a specific number, $35 trillion in national debt. She said that when America crossed that threshold, the mathematics of debt would become impossible to escape. The interest on the debt would consume so much of the federal budget that the government would face an impossible choice: default on obligations or print money into hyperinflation. Either choice, she warned, leads to catastrophe. We are there. The United States national debt is now over $35 trillion. Think about that number. 35 trillion, that's 35,000 billion. That's more than the entire US economy produces in a year. And it's accelerating. We're adding trillions every single year. The Congressional Budget Office projects will hit 40 trillion within a few years. And here's the truly frightening part. The interest on that debt is now over $1 trillion per year. That's more than we spend on national defense. We are paying more just to service our debt than we spend on protecting the country. Dixon warned this would happen. She said we would reach a point where the debt service becomes so massive that it crowds out everything else. No money for infrastructure, no money for education, no money for healthcare. Just endless payments to creditors, most of them foreign. She warned that this would be the moment when faith in the system would begin to crack. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Dixon predicted that other nations would turn their backs on American paper. For decades, the US dollar has been the world's reserve currency. When countries trade with each other, they do it in dollars. When nations build up reserves, they hold dollars. This gives America an enormous privilege. We can print money and export our inflation to the rest of the world. But Dixon warned this privilege would not last forever. She said that when the debt became unsustainable, when America's fiscal irresponsibility became undeniable, other nations would seek alternatives. Look at what's happening. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are actively working to create an alternative to the dollar for international trade. Saudi Arabia is now accepting payment for oil in currencies other than dollars, breaking a 50-year agreement that underpinned dollar dominance. China and Russia are conducting bilateral trade in their own currencies. Central banks around the world are buying gold at record rates, diversifying away from dollar reserves. This is not speculation. This is happening right now. Dixon warned about what comes next. She said that when the dollar loses its reserve currency status, Americans would experience a devastating decline in living standards. Everything we import, and we import almost everything, would become dramatically more expensive. The cheap goods from China, the electronics, the clothing, the appliances that American families depend on, would suddenly cost 2 or 3 times as much. Oil and gas, priced globally, would skyrocket. Americans would discover that their savings, their retirement accounts, their life's work had been devalued by half or more. She called this the Great Unbelieving, the moment when people would realize that their digital account balances were built on nothing but collective faith, and that faith had shattered. But Dixon went even further. She predicted specific mechanisms of collapse that are now manifesting. She warned about bank runs, not just physical lines at banks, but digital runs as people try to move money out of failing institutions. In 2023, we saw Silicon Valley Bank collapse in a matter of days as depositors pulled billions electronically. We saw First Republic Bank fail. We saw Credit Suisse, a 166-year-old institution, collapse and be absorbed in an emergency merger. These are not normal bank failures. These are signs of systemic stress. Dixon warned about credit freezes. She said there would come a moment when businesses couldn't access capital, when supply chains would seize up, when the flow of money that keeps the economy moving would simply stop. We're seeing early signs of this. Small businesses are reporting that banks are tightening lending standards to levels not seen since 2008. Credit card default rates are rising. Auto loan delinquencies are spiking. These are warning signs that the credit system is under strain. She warned about asset deflation, the moment when everyone tries to sell at the same time and discovers there are no buyers. Real estate, stocks, bonds, all collapsing simultaneously as people desperately try to convert paper assets into something tangible. We're seeing the beginning of this in the housing market. Prices are falling in many markets even as mortgage rates remain high, trapping homeowners who can't sell without taking massive losses. Dixon predicted what she called the retirement apocalypse. She warned that Social Security and pension systems would collapse, leaving tens of millions of elderly Americans in poverty. The math is undeniable. Social Security is projected to be insolvent by 2033. That's less than a decade away. When that happens, benefits will have to be cut by 20 to 25%, unless the government massively increases taxes or borrows even more. State and local pension funds are already insolvent in many cases, hiding their true condition with accounting tricks that assume 8% annual returns that will never materialize. Dixon saw elderly Americans being abandoned by the promises made to them. She saw a humanitarian crisis that would overwhelm the nation. And here's the part of Dixon's prophecy that connects to everything else. She warned that the economic collapse would not be an event that ends. It would be a transformation that begins. She said the crash would destroy faith in institutions, making people vulnerable to authoritarian leaders who promise simple solutions. She said it would trigger social chaos as people turned on each other, looking for someone to blame. She said it would leave America unable to respond to natural disasters because the government would have no resources. She said it would make America weak on the global stage, unable to project power, unable to defend allies, unable to prevent wars. The economic collapse is not just one prophecy. It is the engine that drives all the others. Dixon understood something that most people miss. Economic security is the foundation of everything else. When that foundation cracks, everything built on it comes crashing down. Democracy, social cohesion, disaster response, global leadership, all of it depends on economic stability. Remove that stability, and you remove everything. We have crossed Dixon's threshold. $35 trillion in debt. Faith in the dollar declining. Bank failures beginning. Credit tightening. Asset prices unstable. Pension systems insolvent. Every single warning she gave us is manifesting. The question is not whether the collapse will happen. The question is how bad it will be and whether we have the courage to face what's coming. What do you think? Are you seeing signs of economic strain in your own life? Are prices getting harder to manage? Is your job less secure? Are you worried about retirement? Share your experience in the comments. Let's talk about what Dixon warned us about and what we're actually experiencing. The third prophecy, the Great Fracturing. When the center cannot hold. Dixon explicitly connected economic collapse to social disintegration. This is the prophecy that should frighten anyone who loves this country. Because what she predicted was not just political disagreement, but the complete breakdown of American identity itself. She warned that the financial crash would splinter America along every fault line, geographic, political, racial, generational, ideological, and that the nation would fracture into warring tribes that could never be reconciled. She called it the Great Fracturing, and she described it with chilling precision. Dixon said that economic security is the glue that holds diverse societies together. When people have jobs, homes, food on the table, retirement security, they can tolerate differences. They can coexist with people who think differently. But when that security evaporates, people retreat to tribal identities. They look for someone to blame and someone to protect them. They stop seeing fellow citizens and start seeing enemies. Dixon predicted this would manifest in specific ways, and every single one is happening now. First, the regional fracture. Dixon foresaw wealthy states refusing to bail out poorer states and regions with resources, food, water, energy, restricting exports to other parts of the country. She predicted states asserting sovereignty over federal authority, refusing to comply with mandates they disagree with. She specifically mentioned California and Texas as leading movements toward greater autonomy or even secession. Look at what's happening. Texas has been in open defiance of federal immigration policy, deploying state National Guard troops to the border and refusing to allow federal agents access. Governor Abbott has talked about Texas's right to defend itself when the federal government fails to act. California has positioned itself as the resistance to conservative federal policies, creating a parallel structure of state laws that directly contradict federal priorities. Blue states and red states are no longer just voting differently. They're governing differently, creating incompatible systems within the same nation. Dixon saw this coming. She warned that the federal government, bankrupt and delegitimized, would be powerless to hold the Union together. Second, the generational war. Dixon warned of violent conflict between generations. She said younger Americans inheriting an economically destroyed nation and unable to afford basic necessities like housing, education, and health care would turn against the baby boomers who sold their future for comfort. She predicted raids on retirement communities, attacks on Medicare and Social Security recipients, a complete breakdown of the social contract between young and old. This sounds extreme, but look at the rhetoric that's already emerging. Younger Americans are openly expressing rage at boomers for destroying the economy, the climate, and the housing market. There's a growing sentiment that the older generation took everything and left nothing. Home ownership is out of reach for most young people. Student debt is crushing. The jobs available don't pay enough to build the life their parents had. And they're watching elderly boomers sit on massive home equity, collect generous Social Security benefits, and vote against policies that would help younger generations. Dixon saw this resentment turning violent when economic conditions worsen. When young people can't feed their children while retirees live comfortably on benefits funded by taxes those young people pay, the social contract breaks. Third, political violence. Dixon saw blood in the streets of the capital. She predicted armed militias supporting various political factions, assassination attempts on leaders, states refusing to recognize federal authority, and a complete breakdown of the peaceful transfer of power. She said the divisive leader would not calm this violence but would encourage it, using chaos to justify increasingly authoritarian crackdowns. We've already had a taste of this. The January 6th Capitol riot was an attempt to prevent the certification of an election. Armed protesters have shown up at state capitals. There have been plots to kidnap governors. Political figures openly talk about civil war. Rhetoric that was once fringe is now mainstream. Dixon warned that when the economy collapses, when people lose everything, this violence would escalate from isolated incidents to sustained conflict. She predicted Americans would kill each other over politics, something that seems impossible until you realize we've already done it once in our history. Fourth, the information civil war. Though Dixon couldn't have predicted social media specifically, she warned of a war fought with lies, where brother turns against brother not over beliefs but over what is real. She foresaw a complete fragmentation of shared reality, where Americans would live in incompatible information ecosystems, each side convinced the other was not just wrong but evil, making compromise and reconciliation impossible. This is exactly where we are. Americans no longer share a common set of facts. We don't even agree on what constitutes a fact. One side watches Fox News and believes one version of reality. The other side watches MSNBC and believes something completely different. Social media algorithms create echo chambers where people only see information that confirms what they already believe. Conspiracy theories flourish because there's no trusted arbiter of truth. Dixon saw this fragmentation as permanent and fatal. When people can't agree on basic reality, how can they govern themselves together? They can't. That's the point. Fifth, the class uprising. Dixon predicted that the economic crash would finally expose the wealth inequality that had been growing for decades. She warned of the day when the poor look at the castles of the rich and decide to burn them down. She foresaw riots in wealthy neighborhoods, attacks on corporate headquarters, kidnappings of billionaires, a violent rejection of the economic system that failed the majority while enriching the few. Look at the numbers. The wealth gap in America is wider than it's been since the 1920s, right before the Great Depression. 3 billionaires own more wealth than the bottom 50% of Americans combined. CEO pay is 300 times worker pay. Housing is unaffordable. Healthcare bankrupts families. Education costs are crushing. Meanwhile, billionaires are building private space programs and buying social media platforms for fun. Dixon warned that when economic collapse makes this inequality undeniable and unbearable, rage would explode. And it won't be peaceful protests. It will be violence. Here's Dixon's key insight. The fracturing would be permanent. Unlike the Civil War, which ended with military victory and constitutional amendments, this fracturing would have no resolution because it's economic, not just political. With no economic recovery possible under the weight of debt, there would be no prosperity to rebuild consensus. America would remain fractured indefinitely. Dixon called this the end of the American experiment, not because the nation would cease to exist geographically, but because the shared identity of American would become meaningless. People would identify first as Texan, Californian, progressive, conservative, Christian, secular, anything but American. And she warned this fracturing would leave America vulnerable to the disasters coming next, both natural and human-made, because a divided nation cannot mount a coordinated response to existential threats. We're watching her prophecy unfold in real time. The center is not holding, the nation is coming apart. And Dixon warned us it would only get worse. Are you feeling this division in your own life? Have you lost friendships over politics? Do you feel like you're living in a different country than people who vote differently than you? Tell me in the comments what you're seeing. Dixon predicted we would fracture. Are we already there? The fourth prophecy, the land rebels. When nature exploits weakness. Dixon's prophecy about natural disasters was deeply connected to her financial collapse prediction through what she called compounding catastrophes. She warned that the economic crash and social fracturing would leave America completely unprepared and unable to respond to the natural disasters she foresaw accelerating during this same period. The disasters themselves, she said, were inevitable consequences of environmental abuse and climate patterns. But the collapse would transform manageable disasters into civilization-ending catastrophes, because America would lack the resources, unity, and institutional capacity to respond. Dixon was explicit. She warned about specific disasters, specific regions, specific types of events, and she said they would cluster during the period of maximum American weakness, not because of mystical timing, but because vulnerability turns challenges into catastrophes. First, the Western megadrought and megafires. Dixon warned that the American West would face simultaneous water collapse and uncontrollable fires. She predicted cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas would become uninhabitable, triggering mass refugee crises. She specifically mentioned California experiencing fires that consume entire cities in a single day. Look at what's happening. California has experienced the most destructive wildfires in state history over the past decade. Paradise, California was completely destroyed in a single day, 85 people killed, the entire town reduced to ash in hours. The Camp Fire, the Woolsey Fire, the Dixie Fire, each one breaking records, each one more destructive than the last. And it's accelerating. In 2023, Lahaina, Hawaii burned to the ground in a wildfire that killed over 100 people. In 2024, fires have started earlier and burned hotter than ever recorded. The water crisis is equally dire. Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the two largest reservoirs in America, are at historic lows. The Colorado River, which supplies water to 40 million people, is drying up. States are fighting over water rights. Cities are implementing strict rationing. Dixon predicted this would force mass migration, and it's beginning. People are leaving Phoenix and Las Vegas because water is becoming scarce and expensive. She warned that under normal circumstances, the federal government would coordinate response. But when the government has no money and no authority, states would be left to fend for themselves. That's exactly what we're seeing. FEMA is already overwhelmed and underfunded. States are fighting for resources. Disaster response is becoming every state for itself. Second, coastal devastation. Dixon predicted increasingly powerful hurricanes would destroy coastal infrastructure faster than it could be rebuilt. She warned of New Orleans, Miami, and Houston facing biblical flooding that would permanently displace millions. The financial connection is direct. Without federal disaster relief funding, without insurance companies willing to cover climate disasters, these cities would simply be abandoned. Hurricane Katrina was a preview. Hurricane Harvey flooded Houston with catastrophic losses. Hurricane Ian devastated Florida with winds and storm surge that caused over $100 billion in damage. And the hurricanes are getting stronger. Climate scientists confirm that warmer ocean temperatures are creating more powerful, slower-moving storms that dump unprecedented amounts of water. Dixon predicted this would accelerate until coastal cities become unlivable. And here's the economic connection she warned about. Insurance companies are already pulling out of Florida and Louisiana, declaring these states too risky to insure. Homeowners can't get coverage. Property values are collapsing. When the next major hurricane hits, there will be no insurance payouts, no federal bailouts in a bankrupt government, just millions of people with destroyed homes and nowhere to go. Dixon predicted coastal regions would be permanently abandoned. We're watching it begin. Third, agricultural collapse. Dixon warned of the year the heartland fails, when multiple climatic factors, drought, floods, extreme temperatures, would devastate American agriculture simultaneously. She predicted food shortages, riots over resources, and farmers losing their land en masse. The signs are undeniable. The Midwest has experienced devastating floods alternating with severe droughts. The Ogallala Aquifer, which supplies water to agricultural states, is being depleted faster than it can recharge. Extreme heat is making farming increasingly difficult. Crop yields are becoming unpredictable. Dixon warned that when the economic crash eliminates farm subsidies and support programs, farmers would face ruin. And when American agriculture fails, where does the food come from? Dixon predicted food shortages and rationing, something Americans haven't experienced since World War II. Fourth, the New Madrid earthquake. Dixon specifically prophesied a massive earthquake in the central United States, the New Madrid fault line, that would destroy critical infrastructure across multiple states. She warned this would sever supply chains between East and West, collapse bridges over the Mississippi River, and devastate cities like Memphis and St. Louis. Her prophecy emphasized this would occur when the nation is already on its knees, transforming a regional disaster into a national death blow. Seismologists confirm the New Madrid fault is overdue for a major earthquake. The last big one was in 1811-1812, a series of quakes so powerful they rang church bells in Boston and reversed the flow of the Mississippi River temporarily. When the next one hits, and experts say it's not if but when, the destruction will be catastrophic because modern infrastructure sits directly on the fault line. And Dixon warned it would hit when America lacks the resources to respond. Imagine trying to rebuild while bankrupt, divided, and dealing with all the other disasters she predicted. Fifth, the Cascadia subduction event. Dixon warned of the greatest natural disaster in American history, a magnitude 9.0 or higher earthquake and subsequent tsunami that would destroy the Pacific Northwest coastline from Northern California to British Columbia. She predicted this would kill hundreds of thousands in minutes, permanently eliminate Seattle and Portland as functioning cities, and cut off the entire region from the rest of the country for months or years. Scientists confirm this threat is real. The Cascadia subduction zone is a 600-mile fault off the Pacific coast where one tectonic plate is sliding under another. It produces a massive earthquake roughly every 300 to 600 years. The last one was in 1700. We're overdue. When it hits, coastal areas will have minutes to evacuate before a tsunami 50 to 100 feet high destroys everything. Cities will be flattened. Hundreds of thousands will die. And Dixon warned this would happen when America is already collapsing, making recovery impossible. Here's what Dixon understood that most people miss. These disasters aren't punishment. They're the inevitable result of where we've chosen to live and how we've treated the environment. But timing matters. Past disasters were survivable because of federal response, insurance systems, economic resources, social cohesion. Dixon foresaw all those resources would be absent when these disasters cluster. The economic crash eliminates government response capacity. The social fracturing means regions won't help each other. The bankrupt insurance industry won't pay claims. The result, she warned, would be disasters from which the nation never recovers. Destroyed cities would stay destroyed. Displaced populations would become permanent refugees. Agricultural collapse would mean persistent food insecurity. America's habitable geography would literally shrink. Dixon warned that the disasters would serve as the proof that America is finished, the visible, undeniable evidence that the nation can no longer protect its citizens or maintain basic civilization. Have you noticed the disasters accelerating? Are you seeing extreme weather in your area that never used to happen? Are you worried about fire, flood, drought, or earthquakes where you live? Drop a comment and let me know what you're seeing. Dixon warned the land would rebel. It's happening. Now we come to Dixon's final prophecy, the one she said frightened her most. Global conflict and America's role, the vacuum that ignites the world. Dixon warned that America's internal collapse would not occur in isolation, but would trigger a global power vacuum that would ignite conflicts around the world, potentially culminating in a world war that America would be powerless to prevent or win. This was her most terrifying vision because it took everything else: the economic collapse, the divisive leader, the social fracturing, the natural disasters, and showed how it would cascade beyond America's borders, creating global catastrophe. Dixon's prophecy was rooted in a fundamental understanding. For 75 years, American power, military, economic, cultural, had served as the reluctant policeman maintaining relative global stability. She predicted that when the financial crash, political division, and natural disasters crippled America, adversarial powers would move aggressively to fill the vacuum, and without American deterrence, long-simmering conflicts would explode simultaneously. First, the Pacific War. Dixon explicitly warned that China would interpret American weakness as an opportunity to reclaim what they believe is theirs. She predicted a military move against Taiwan would occur when America is consumed with crisis at home and cannot respond. She warned this wouldn't be a limited action but the beginning of Chinese regional dominance, with Japan, South Korea, and other allies forced to either submit or fight alone. Look at the current situation. China has become increasingly aggressive toward Taiwan. Military exercises simulating invasion, daily incursions into Taiwanese airspace. Open statements from Chinese leadership that reunification is inevitable and will happen on their timeline. And they're watching America closely. They see the political dysfunction. They see the economic stress. They see the social division. Dixon warned that China would strike when America is weakest, and they're waiting for that moment. The implications are staggering. Taiwan produces over 60% of the world's semiconductors, the chips that power everything from smartphones to fighter jets. If China seizes Taiwan, they control the global technology supply chain. American companies, the American military, would be at China's mercy. Dixon predicted the American military, demoralized and defunded due to economic crisis, would be unable to mount an effective defense. The choice would be humiliating retreat or nuclear escalation. Either option is catastrophic. Second, the Middle East inferno. Dixon foresaw that American withdrawal from the Middle East, forced by economic constraints and domestic focus, would trigger immediate wars over oil, water, and religious supremacy. She predicted Israel would face an existential threat requiring the use of nuclear weapons. She warned of the oil fields of the Persian Gulf being set ablaze, creating economic shockwaves that would compound the already devastated global economy. We're watching this unfold. American influence in the Middle East is declining. Iran is closer to nuclear weapons than ever. The Abraham Accords were a step toward peace, but tensions remain explosive. Hamas's attack on Israel in October 2023 triggered a war that has expanded to involve Hezbollah, Iranian proxies, and threatens to pull in regional powers. Dixon warned that without American mediation and military presence, the region would descend into conflicts that would make previous wars look like children's games. If the Persian Gulf oil infrastructure is destroyed in regional war, the global economy collapses overnight. Oil prices would spike to levels that would make transportation and commerce impossible. Dixon saw this as inevitable once America withdraws. Third, Russian expansion. Dixon predicted Russia would move to reclaim former Soviet territories and expand influence into Eastern Europe when the American shield is withdrawn. She warned of attacks on NATO allies that America would be unable or unwilling to defend, destroying the alliance system and leaving Europe vulnerable. The Ukraine war is a preview of exactly what Dixon warned about. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the largest land war in Europe since World War II. American support has been critical to Ukraine's survival, but it's becoming politically controversial. If America, facing economic collapse and internal crisis, withdraws support, Ukraine falls. And if Ukraine falls, Russia won't stop there. The Baltic states, Poland, Romania, all former Soviet territories or satellites would be next. Dixon warned that NATO would dissolve because America would be unable to honor its commitments. European nations, watching the US collapse internally, would make separate accommodations with Russia for their own survival. The alliance system that prevented World War III for 75 years would shatter. Fourth, nuclear brinkmanship. Dixon's most terrifying prophecy was about nuclear weapons. She warned that America's weakness would lead multiple nations to believe they could use nuclear weapons without American retaliation. She predicted limited nuclear exchanges in regional conflicts: India versus Pakistan, Israel versus Iran, China versus India, that America would be powerless to prevent. She warned that the global nuclear taboo held in place by American power would shatter, making nuclear warfare thinkable again. Think about the implications. Since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, nuclear weapons have not been used in war because everyone understood that use would trigger American response and potentially global annihilation. That mutual understanding kept the weapons in their silos. But Dixon warned that when America is collapsing internally, bankrupt, divided, dealing with disasters at home, Adversaries would calculate that they could use tactical nuclear weapons in regional conflicts, and America would do nothing. She predicted the first use would be in South Asia or the Middle East, a relatively small weapon, maybe tens of thousands dead instead of millions. And when America fails to respond decisively, the barrier is broken. Other nations see that nuclear use is possible. The weapons come out of the silos. Dixon warned that once nuclear weapons are used again, the probability of wider nuclear war increases exponentially. She predicted multiple nuclear exchanges, cities destroyed, millions dead, radioactive fallout spreading across continents. And she warned that America, consumed with its own crisis, would be unable to lead any coalition to stop it. The world would descend into nuclear chaos while America watches helplessly. Fifth, the alliance collapse. Dixon predicted that American allies watching the United States collapse internally would make separate accommodations with rival powers for their own survival. She foresaw Japan and South Korea pursuing independent nuclear programs, no longer trusting America's nuclear umbrella. She saw European nations making deals with Russia for energy and security. She saw Middle Eastern allies realigning with China, which offers investment without demanding democratic reforms. She predicted a complete disintegration of the American-led world order that had defined the post-World War II era. This is already beginning. Saudi Arabia is deepening ties with China and Russia. Turkey is playing both sides. European nations are discussing independent defense capabilities that don't rely on America. Japan is debating whether to develop nuclear weapons. These are profound shifts that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Dixon saw this acceleration once America's collapse becomes undeniable. Why would allies chain themselves to a sinking ship? They wouldn't. They would scramble to align with rising powers, leaving America isolated. Sixth, resource wars. Dixon warned that the combination of climate disasters, agricultural failures, and economic collapse would trigger wars over basic resources: water, food, arable land, energy. She predicted mass migrations numbering in the hundreds of millions as regions become uninhabitable. She warned of walls and militarized borders becoming universal, and genocidal violence against refugees and minority populations. We're seeing early signs of this global refugee crisis already. Climate change is driving migration from Africa to Europe, from Central America to the United States, from Southeast Asia throughout the region. But Dixon predicted this would explode into the largest human migration in history. Hundreds of millions of people fleeing drought, flooding, crop failures, unlivable heat. And she warned that America, facing its own resource scarcity and internal refugees from climate disasters, would close its borders and abandon any pretense of humanitarian leadership. She saw walls going up everywhere, nations fighting over water rights, food becoming a weapon of war. Here's Dixon's key insight about global conflict. These wars wouldn't happen despite American collapse, they would happen because of it. She warned that adversarial powers were waiting, watching, planning for the moment when America would be too weak, divided, and distracted to intervene. The financial crash would be that signal. When America crosses the $35 trillion debt threshold, when the economic crisis begins, when the internal chaos escalates, that's when adversaries make their moves. They strike when America cannot respond. But Dixon went even further. She predicted America would not just fail to prevent these conflicts, it would become a participant in ways that would horrify Americans. She warned that the divisive leader facing domestic chaos and seeking to distract from failures would involve America in unwinnable wars fought for lies. She predicted American military forces would be deployed not to defend democracy or allies, but to secure resources for domestic survival: oil, food, minerals. America would transform from global protector into global predator. Dixon foresaw America's reputation as a force for freedom and democracy being permanently destroyed. She warned that history would remember this period as the time when America chose itself over the world, and in doing so, lost both. The moral authority that America claimed, however imperfectly, for decades would be revealed as hollow. The world would see America for what it had become, just another declining empire willing to do anything to postpone the inevitable. The prophecy's bleakest element was her prediction that America would retreat into fortress mentality, closing borders, hoarding resources, watching the world burn while focused solely on internal survival. She warned that this isolationism wouldn't save America from the chaos. It would simply mean America would fall alone, without allies, without sympathy, without hope of rescue. Dixon's final warning about global conflict was about cascading effects. Regional wars would destroy global trade, causing further economic devastation. Nuclear exchanges would create environmental catastrophes, compounding climate disasters. Mass migration would fuel internal political extremism. Each conflict would make every other crisis worse, creating a feedback loop of collapse. And she warned there would be no one, no nation, no alliance, no institution powerful enough to stop it. The American-led order would be gone. The United Nations would be powerless. The world would descend into a new dark age of great power competition, resource wars, and nuclear brinkmanship. Dixon made one final statement in 1996 that still echoes. She said, "I have seen the world after America falls. It is dark. It is violent. It is a place where might makes right and the strong devour the weak, and there is no one, no nation, no alliance, no institution powerful enough to stop it." Are you seeing America's global influence declining? Do you worry about world war? Do you think America can still lead? Or are we watching the empire collapse? Tell me what you think in the comments. Dixon warned about the vacuum. It's forming right now. Before we talk about what comes next, if this video is opening your eyes to what's really happening, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Share this video with your friends and family. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next prophetic revelation. We're living through the exact timeline Dixon warned us about, and you need to stay informed. Now let's talk about what Dixon said about what comes after the collapse. We've covered Dixon's 5 prophecies: the divisive leader, the economic reckoning, the great fracturing, the land rebelling, the global conflict. Each one is manifesting right now, cascading from the financial collapse she predicted would begin when debt crossed $35 trillion. We're there. It's happening. But Dixon didn't end her prophecies with doom. She left us with 2 final visions, 2 possible futures for humanity. And the choice between them, she insisted, is still ours. Dixon warned about the long night. She said that if humanity continued on its current path, refusing to change even in the face of catastrophe, the collapse would be total, and the darkness would last longer than any living person would survive to see its end. She described a world where civilization itself collapsed, where technological society gave way to localized survival communities, where knowledge and progress were lost, where humanity experienced a reset that would take centuries to recover from, if recovery was even possible. This wasn't metaphor. Dixon was describing actual civilizational collapse, the power grids failing permanently, supply chains dissolving, cities becoming uninhabitable, modern medicine unavailable, billions of people dying from starvation, disease, violence. The survivors reverting to pre-industrial existence, farming by hand if they could farm at all, trading goods instead of using money, living in small, defended communities where outsiders were threats. She saw the loss of literacy, the destruction of libraries and databases, the forgetting of science and history. She warned that the long night would be a dark age that made the medieval period look enlightened by comparison. Why would this happen? Dixon said it was a failure of consciousness. Humanity would face the collapse and learn nothing from it. People would respond with tribalism, violence, authoritarianism. They would fight over the scraps of the old system instead of building something new. They would repeat the same mistakes that caused the collapse in the first place. Greed, short-term thinking, worship of power, domination of nature, exploitation of the weak. The long night would be the consequence of spiritual failure, humanity proving itself incapable of learning, evolving, or choosing a better path. But Dixon also offered an alternative vision. She called it the Great Awakening. She predicted that catastrophe could serve as the great teacher that humanity had refused to learn from in gentler times. She foresaw the possibility that the collapse would shock people into recognizing the fundamental failures of the system. The greed that concentrated wealth while millions suffered. The short-term thinking that borrowed from the future and destroyed the environment. The worship of money over meaning, power over purpose, consumption over community. The inequality that allowed some to live like kings while others starved. She predicted that from the ashes of the old system, a new consciousness could emerge, one based on cooperation instead of competition, sustainability instead of exploitation, community instead of individualism. Dixon was explicit. The Great Awakening would not be comfortable or easy. It would require humanity to abandon nearly everything it had been taught about success, power, and progress. It would require people to choose solidarity over self-interest, even when they were desperate and afraid. It would require leaders to emerge who genuinely served rather than dominated. It would require a fundamental reimagining of what civilization could be. What would this look like? Dixon described a world where people recognize that we are interdependent, that we survive together or perish alone. She saw communities forming based on mutual aid instead of competition. She saw people sharing resources instead of hoarding them. She saw the end of the billionaire class as obscene wealth concentration became socially unacceptable. She saw renewable energy and sustainable agriculture replacing extractive industries. She saw direct democracy replacing corrupt representative systems. She saw people valuing relationships, community, and purpose over money and status. She predicted a great simplification. The complexity of modern life, the financial instruments, the supply chains, the technological dependence, all of it would collapse. But from that simplification, Dixon saw the possibility of people rediscovering what actually matters. Food, water, shelter, community, love, purpose. She warned that billions would die in the transition. The collapse would be catastrophic regardless of which path humanity chose. But the survivors could build something better if they learned the lessons. Dixon saw both futures as possible, not predetermined. The dark timeline emerges if humanity remains unchanged by catastrophe. If people respond to crisis with tribalism, violence, and authoritarianism. The awakening timeline emerges if enough people choose differently. If the pain of collapse breaks through the illusions and forces a genuine transformation in consciousness and values. And here's what she said about America specifically. Dixon predicted that America's collapse would be the catalyst for the world's choice. Because America had been the global hegemon, the model that other nations followed, its fall would force everyone to reckon with the failures of the system. Would they try to recreate what failed, or would they build something new? She said America's collapse would be the great awakening moment for humanity, the shock that could finally break through the denial and force real change. But she warned that awakening is not automatic. It requires choice, individual choice. Every single person who watches this video will face that choice. When the financial crash comes, and Dixon warned us it's coming, when you watch your savings disappear, your retirement plans evaporate, your job vanish, will you look for a strong man to blame others, or will you seek to build community with your neighbors? When resources become scarce, will you hoard for yourself, or will you share with those in need? When disasters strike, will you abandon others to save yourself? Or will you recognize that we survive together or perish alone? When the old system collapses, will you try to recreate it, or will you help build something better? These are not abstract questions. Dixon warned these are the choices you will face, possibly within years, certainly within your lifetime. The collapse is not coming. It has begun. We crossed the $35 trillion threshold. The prophecies are manifesting. The question is not whether Dixon's warnings will come true. The question is what you will choose to do when they do. Dixon left us with one final message. She said that even in the darkest moment, even when everything seems lost, humans have the power to choose awakening over annihilation. She insisted that the future is not written, that prophecy is warning, not fate. She showed us the consequences of our choices, hoping we would make different ones. So let me ask you directly, what will you choose? When the crash comes, when the systems fail, when you're forced to decide between fear and love, between hoarding and sharing, between violence and community, what will you choose? Because your choice matters. Dixon believed that if enough people choose awakening, if enough people reject the old consciousness and embrace a new way of being, humanity could survive this and build something better. But if we remain unchanged, if we cling to greed, division, and domination even as the world burns, then the long night will come, and it will last for generations. The choice is yours. The choice is all of ours. Dixon gave us the warning. She showed us what's coming. She told us when it would begin. We crossed that threshold. Now we're living the cascade. What happens next depends on what we choose. I want to hear from you. What are you going to do? Are you preparing practically? Are you building community? Are you changing how you think about what matters? Or are you waiting for someone to save you? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about what comes next and how we navigate it together. And if this video resonated with you, if Dixon's warnings are opening your eyes to what's really happening, share this video everywhere. Your friends and family need to hear this. Subscribe to this channel for more prophetic revelations that mainstream media won't tell you about. Turn on notifications so you're ready for what's coming next. Jeane Dixon told us what happens when debt devours the nation, when division replaces unity, when we ignore the land's warnings, when we let leaders exploit our fears, when we turn away from the world's suffering. She showed us the cascade of collapse that follows from our failures. But she also told us that even in the darkest moment, even when everything seems lost, we have the power to choose awakening over annihilation. The prophecies are unfolding exactly as she warned. The financial crash is here. The divisive leader has risen. The nation is fracturing. The disasters are accelerating. The global conflicts are erupting. Everything she predicted is manifesting right before our eyes. The only question left is what we will do with the time we have remaining. Dixon's final warning echoes across the decades. When the crash comes, it will not be a recession that ends. It will be a transformation that begins. The transformation can be death or rebirth. The choice is still ours, but time is running out. The debt clock ticks past $35 trillion. Dixon's prophecy is fulfilled. What comes next is in your hands. Choose wisely. Choose soon. Choose awakening. Because the alternative is a darkness that will swallow everything we know and last longer than any of us will live to see its end. This is the warning. This is the prophecy. This is the moment. What will you do with it?